life decisions. No. Speaking of life decisions, could you please silence your cell phones and other electronic devices? Wouldn't that be fun?
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's always, it's happened to me.
It would be me.
Yeah, it would happen to me too. Which is why I say it, so that I then make sure that my beepers, my pagers, my tablets, I don't have any of those things, but my phone is off. All right. Welcome to the Rose O'Neill Literary House. Is there anyone for whom this is your first time at the Lit House? You've all been here before? Okay, great. I am Dr. Hall. I'm the director of the Rose O'Neill Literary House. I am joined today by Diannely Antigua. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm going to read a bio and a whole introduction. Poetry is a lifeline, the poet, educator, and podcaster Diannely Antigua has said in an interview, actually an interview that serves as the most recent episode of her podcast, Bread and Poetry, a show where Antigua breaks bread with poets, building community along the way. The name of the show is inspired by a line of poetry, I believe the world is beautiful, and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. Roque Dalton writes in his poem, Como Tu, which we printed out and you have on your chairs. So you'll have the whole poem. We'll maybe start there in a minute. Antigua is a Dominican-American poet born and raised in Massachusetts. Her books include the just-released Good Monster, which and Ugly Music, which won Antigua a prestigious Whiting Award, among other things. In 2022, she was proclaimed the 13th Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the youngest and first person of color to receive the title. In 2023, she was awarded an Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship to launch the Bread and Poetry Project, and in 2024, she was awarded an Excellence in Artistry Award from Black Lives Matter New Hampshire. She currently teaches in the Graduate Creative Writing Program at the University of New Hampshire, where she is the inaugural Nasrat Yassini Poet in Residence, and she hosts the podcast Bread and Poetry, which seeks to make poetry accessible to all in a way that nourishes the soul. Bread and Poetry is right now on hiatus. Looking for funds. Anybody want to donate? We can, to make that happen. But please join me in welcoming Diannely Antigua to Washington College. Let's start with the poem. Would you read it to us?
Yes.
Twice?
Yes.
Yay.
Yeah. Give it a microphone.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just like sitting here with it like a torch.
I'll read it in Spanish first, since that's what it was written in, and then I will read the translation. Como tú. Yo, como tú, amo el amor, la vida, el dulce encanto de las cosas, el paisaje celeste de los días de enero. También mi sangre bulle y río por los ojos que han conocido el brote de las lágrimas. Creo que el mundo es bello, que la poesía es como el pan de todos y que mis venas no terminan en mí, sino en la sangre unánime de los que luchan por la vida, el amor, las cosas, el paisaje y el pan, la poesía de todos. Like you, I love love. Life, the sweet smell of things, the sky blue landscape of January days. And my blood boils up and I laugh through eyes that have known the buds of tears. I believe the world is beautiful and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. And that my veins don't end in me, but in the unanimous blood of those who struggle for life, love, little things, landscape, and bread, the poetry of everyone.
Thank you. I think we can say thank you by clapping for that. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I told Diannely that I would also come out as a podcaster since I have a podcast. And
Finally.
Yeah, finally. I don't talk about the podcast that I co-host very widely on campus because it's a dirty gay poetry podcast that I usually describe to other people as it's a quickie in a sleazy motel with a fabulous library. That's how I describe it. And so it's poetry, but like we play pretty risque games. I'm not saying go listen to it. I'm just saying. So I also said to Diannely if she wants to, inhabit her interviewer's position, she can turn the questions on me too, and we can just have a conversation about why podcasting, which is actually my first question. Why podcasting? Why did you decide on that medium for the Bread and Poetry Project?
Yeah, so I think that podcasting just seemed like the right choice for me. And it happened because of things in my early life that I was told as a child. I was told that I had a voice for radio. And that radio actually runs in my family. My grandmother used to sing on the radio in the Dominican Republic back in the day. My father was he had a radio show, and it was called Domingo Tu y Yo, Sunday You and I, and he would play Spanish ballads. And then my stepfather also, he was a radio preacher. So I was always surrounded by voices coming out of radios, or, speakers. And, my stepfather had a lot of radio equipment in the house. And I just remember playing around with the microphones and just being so enchanted by it. And I loved just talking into it and hearing my voice come out of the speaker. That sounds really narcissistic, but I think to be a podcaster, in a way you have to like the sound of your voice ever so. But I think I always wanted to have a podcast, and it took becoming poet laureate to realize, okay, the podcast is going to be about poetry. I think for a while I originally was thinking about a podcast that was more about mental illness. But in a way, the podcast about poetry, we talk just about anything. We talk about love, life, mental illness. We talk about body neutrality. That was one of the things that we talked about last year. But it just really ranges from different topics. But because of that love of radio, I felt like the podcast was the right choice for me. And I really wanted something that I felt could last beyond my term and could be something that I could continue to do for fun, for enjoyment, as a passion project beyond being poet laureate. And as I say in my intro, I say I'm poet laureate of your hearts. And I feel like I can still hold that title even though I'm not poet laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire anymore. But really my goal was I just wanted to make poetry accessible to all, and I wanted to be able to present that to folks in a way that was digestible. I wanted to invite a guest to come on the show and talk about a poem that they wrote, and then talk about a poem that they brought in written by someone else. But we would also talk about bread. Obviously, the podcast is called Bread and Poetry. How could we not talk about bread? And who doesn't love bread? I fucking love bread. And the funny thing is that I actually shouldn't eat gluten when I have a podcast about bread, but I eat it anyways. I don't recommend that though. If you're not supposed to have gluten, don't eat it. Don't be like me. But it just is a great place to start having a conversation about bread. You start a meal with bread, breaking of bread. And I wanted the podcast to, start the same. And on the podcast, I ask folks what their favorite type of bread is. That's kind of like the icebreaker. And then we go just a little bit deeper, and I ask them to tell me a beautiful, powerful, or challenging memory that includes bread. And you would be surprised the things that people bring up when they talk about a memory that involves bread. One of them was about pita bread, and my guest, Matt Miller, was talking about how his father was dying in the hospital, and one of the last meals that his father ate was a meal from a Lebanese restaurant in Lowell, and with the meal came pita bread. He was recounting that memory of like watching his father eat pita bread, and just every time someone shares another memory, we just go somewhere else, and that opens the door for conversations about everything, and also it ends up tying into things about the poems we talk about too. And then at the end of discussing bread and the poems, I think one of the most important parts of the podcast is what I call the gluten-free segment, which is, anyone can indulge in this segment because it is gluten-free, but it's a writing prompt. I really wanted to hand listeners the tools necessary in order to write poems for themselves, rather than having a highly intellectual conversation about poetry. We all know those podcasts. They're great, and also sometimes it can even be over my head sometimes. And I really wanted to make it feel accessible, and rather than this feeling like, oh, poetry is just for the elite, it's something that I have to decode. No, like, you can also write poems too, and here's how. Let's talk about it. Here's a writing prompt. And I love that part of the podcast because I think that's the part that feels most empowering to listeners, even to me. I've written a lot of poems using the writing prompts that we've discussed on the podcast. I think I probably answered so many different questions in that, but just podcasting just fit, and the vision just came to me. Once I was like, oh, bread and poetry, and then I was like, I'm gonna have this segment and that segment, and it was easy to think of the ideas, and yeah.
Oh, cool. Now, I wanted to, when you said the thing about listening to your voice come out of the speaker, and we call the person in the poem the speaker, I was thinking about, do you feel like that's how poems are? Do you feel like you're wandering by and, oh, there's a speaker, and you're listening to a voice? Have you thought? I've never thought about that. Have you?
No, but
Yeah.
I'm interested in trying to answer or think about that out loud with you. But yeah, it's interesting, like when you hear yourself over a speaker, or your voice doesn't sound the same like it sounds in your head. It sounds different. And I think that's similar to even a speaker in a poem that feels very much like you but isn't you. It's similar to that. It sounds different in your head versus what it sounds like outside of your own head. And I would say my poems feel the same. I own the poetry that I am the speaker for the most part, but I wouldn't say that necessarily everything that has happened to the speaker in my poems has happened to me, but it's based on a emotional truth rather than a factual truth.
Yeah, I'd say the same for me too. And I do not, how many of us enjoy the sound of our own voices? How many of us avoid hearing the sound of our own voices? The little shy hands. We shouldn't be shy about that. It's fine, right? And yeah, oh good. I'm sorry, I had to scratch my eye, so I couldn't see. I asked a question and said, give me the survey. And it's interesting about breaking form that I agreed to do it with my friend Erin. as long as I did not have to do the editing, because I did not want to listen to my voice. But of course I had to, because we give ourselves carte blanche to say whatever we want, and then I have to listen to make sure that I didn't sound like an idiot or say something that I get canceled for, because I will shoot off at the mouth a lot. Anyway, so listening to my voice, I actually heard myself and like confronted myself in a weird way, and that I think the podcast actually helped me come out as non-binary. I think that maybe that journey would have happened, but I think it accelerated it. Wow. I know, and I never said that to anyone else except for Aaron. I've never said that out loud to other people. So here I am, being vulnerable. Oh, thank you. I had hoped you would talk. No. But no, and thank you for sort of giving us an introduction to the podcast. That was my job, and you did it. And thank you for doing that. You said that your goal is also to demystify poetry, and you talked a little bit about that there, or to make it accessible. And what do you think people need from poems? Bread nourishes us. How do poems nourish us?
Yeah, you quoted what I said in one of my own interviews, which was poetry is a lifeline.
Yeah.
And I think to understand like why I feel that poetry is so nourishing is to kind of understand a little bit more of my backstory and how poems saved me. Yeah, so now I'm gonna be vulnerable. I'm gonna take a little stab at it. So I grew up in a very abusive household. There was domestic violence, sexual abuse. And I also grew up in a strict religious system where every aspect of my life was controlled. And there were, obviously, I didn't leave that unscathed. I, from a young age, was exhibiting signs of mental illness, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, self-harm. And I didn't have anyone to talk to about it. Especially considering, coming from, my background, being, an immigrant family, and also like a religious family, therapy was not allowed, and we didn't talk about that. That was not an option. Medication, absolutely not. That was not an option either. I was told to pray and read my Bible, and that God would take care of it. But God did not take care of it. And what took care of it was talking about it, but talking to myself, which was writing. And I started writing in journals when I was 9 years old. My oldest sister gave me a journal for Christmas. And at first I started writing about things that, a 9-year-old writes about, which is the Backstreet Boys, or I loved AJ because he was the bad boy. In and out of rehab, I was like, that's my guy. and then it became a place for me to explore some of what I was feeling inside. Just this desire to live my life differently, but not being allowed to. And this desire to not exist anymore. And it was a place for me to really be able to commune with myself. And then later on, I started to experiment with different genres, and I wrote some short stories, and poetry came along, and then that's what really stuck for me. I was like, oh, this is what makes sense. This is what I've been waiting for. Kind of like when you fall in love, and you see that person for the first time, it was love at first sight. And with poetry, it was definitely love at first sight. I knew that this was something so powerful, and that my life wouldn't be the same after meeting her, And I think that's why, with the podcast, I really wanted to present poetry in a way that demystified it and made it accessible, because I knew what poetry could do, the power that it possesses, and to change a life. I wouldn't be alive without poetry. Like I wouldn't be here sitting with you, James, without poems. Poetry has found me in many different places. In the ICU and the psych ward, and also beautiful places like this room, or like sharing my poetry at a poetry reading or in the classroom. And I'm so grateful for that, and I just really wanted to gift my listeners that opportunity to be able to harness poetry, the power of it for themselves. And not so much that it has to change their life, but I wanted to do something beautiful in their lives, whatever it is, and to whatever extent it will. But I wanted to be able to give them that gift because I know just truly how life-changing poetry can be.
Thank you for going there. Actually, I'm a little choked up right now. And so I knew we might get to this kind of place. So would you read a poem by Lucille Clifton that I've heard you read?
Yes.
Let's see if I have it. But I think I saw you, yeah, here it is. I think I saw you read this poem, and I just think this moment might warrant this poem.
Won't You Celebrate With Me by Lucille Clifton. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight, my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed.
In that poem. I have a few copies. Yeah, I'd like to talk about them too. Called from Miss Lucille. Yeah, I was from there, or not from, but lived in Maryland a very long time and taught not far from here. Yeah, and has failed. Fuck you.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel that in your poems. I also feel that one of your teachers was Sharon Olds, who famously, do you know the story about how when she graduated from Columbia, do you know this story?
I don't think so.
Okay, so Sharon Olds goes and gets a PhD in literature from Columbia University, and graduates and stands on the steps of this building, beautiful steps, Columbia, New York City, out, and she says that she made an oath to Satan that if she could write her poems, if she could just write her poems, she would dedicate her life to writing poetry. And she's since clarified that Satan was not what she thought. She thought of it as Satan because she grew up in a very strict religious household as well, very oppressed. Father was abusive. And she thought of Satan as the liberating force, right? The things that the bad things that we're not allowed to say or supposed to say. And so she went and got a PhD, and she's like, actually, I kind of want to write my poems, And so I was thinking about, that the use of voice, right? Like especially from someone who's been silenced, and how powerful that is, to say the things that are dangerous or unallowed, feels like a freedom. To me, anyway. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it definitely feels like a freedom. And also, at least for me, I feel like it's part of my responsibility to share. And, especially like being a public-facing figure as a poet laureate, also being an educator, even just being an aunt, I feel like it's my responsibility to talk about the tough things, the difficult things. Someone has to do it, we can't just leave it up to chance. that someone will come across the resources that they need or the right person to talk to. We need to present ourselves to be the right people to talk to. I want to, own my experiences in a way that someone then feels comfortable to be able to reach out to me as a source of help or just to commune with. And so it's not even just about like being silenced or the liberation of saying something, but also how that can liberate someone else. And then that reminds me of Toni Morrison, right? Which I don't want to misquote the great Toni Morrison, but basically I think the gist of what she said was like the responsibility of freedom is to free someone else or something along those lines. I butchered that completely, but the essence is still there. But once I felt liberated in my poetry practice of telling the truth, my own truth, I hope that then liberates someone else to do the same. Not necessarily it being in a poem, but just to themselves and in their own lives.
Yeah, I think often about who does the silence serve? And it's generally not the people who have been oppressed or have been violated. It's generally, the person who's done the abusing of the power, right? All right, so for those of us who came to the room to think about like the mechanics of podcasts, so how do you make a podcast? Like, how much does it cost to make a podcast? Like, what goes into it? How would you start from scratch? I mean, I assume you started from scratch, right? Nobody said, oh, I have this show, would you like to, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about like the logistics of podcasting. The one thing that was great about, at least, my situation when it came to podcasting is that the Portsmouth Poet Laureate program bought all of my equipment because I was Poet Laureate. They received money from the New Hampshire Charitable Fund, and they used that money to help fund the Poet Laureate's programming for their 2-year term. And mine happens to be the podcast, so they bought the equipment for me, which is not something that I would have been able to do for myself. That equipment can be pretty expensive if you want a good microphone, and if you want a programming to use in order to edit the episodes, that all costs money, and money that I, a poet, did not have and still really don't. That's why if you have funding and want to fund my podcast, please come see me, write me an email, anything. But basically, like it starts with the sound. You need the sound equipment. You need the microphones, and but it just became like so much more than just that. Especially when it came down to learning how to edit the podcasts. And I'm not a sound engineer. I had no idea what I was doing, and quite honestly, I still don't know what I'm doing. But it was a role that I had to play, especially like in the first year, where I committed to this project, and I also was committing to editing them. And like I watched YouTube videos. I even called friends who I knew had experience with audio equipment and tried to learn from them. And a lot of musicians, especially in the Portsmouth area, that knew about just the equipment itself. And so the first few episodes and the first few months of getting this project off the ground was a lot of just learning, and nothing really was happening as far as tangible material. It was just me fiddling around with GarageBand and trying to make sure that all the levels were right, and and even just the what is it called? I can't even think of it right now, but all of the mouth clicks. The mouth clicks. That's another thing. There's a whole program that you use in order to get rid of those. Yeah, or just the mouth noises. Yes, yeah. It's called a declicker. Yeah, isotope declicker. I'm not lying to you. I am not lying.
Oh my god.
Yes. And that also costs money, but I didn't know that any of those things even existed. So it was just a lot of learning, and then finally in my second year of being poet laureate, I received the fellowship from the Academy of American Poets, the Poets Laureate Fellowship, which I was able to then fund the editing portion of the podcast to someone else, to actual professionals who knew what they were doing, and I got in touch with a production company, just someone who did it for fun out of her own home and had a small little team, and she's a mom and just wanted to do something for herself. So she does sound engineering on the side, and she really devoted a lot of time to getting to know the podcast, listened to a lot of the episodes, and so much so that she was the one to cut the episodes down from whatever the raw material was to be about hour-long episodes, and I just trusted her to do that she knew what material would be important to me because she had listened to all of the episodes so far. So I really, really appreciated someone getting to know my podcast in that way, and because it was my baby. It still is my baby. It's something that I created. It's my brainchild, and she took really good care of it. But it's not easy to start a podcast, even though I think everyone has one. I feel like when I was dating and meeting someone on Tinder, they're like, what do you like to do for fun? Like, I have a podcast. It was everyone was like, oh, okay. So everyone has a podcast. Anyone can do it, but also at the same time, if you want to do it well, it does cost money and time if you want to learn how to use that equipment properly.
Ballpark figure? How much would it?
I would say probably you want to invest I'd say $1,000 on the stage, to be on the stage side, in order to get the right equipment and to also get the right software and the right laptop or desktop that would be able to handle that equipment too. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, if you listen to Breaking Form, and I'm not saying you should.
You should.
I would say listen to the episode we did with Diannely. That was really fun. I quote it often. Also, you and Aaron just had a little love fest. You had never met, and there's something about your backgrounds I thought that really,
yes.
I was glad to be present at that meeting. Because it just felt like, oh, these two people fell in love and I got to watch it. It was really nice. But yeah, and Aaron originally, so Breaking Form started because Aaron was like, I need something to do. And I was like, I don't need anything to do, Aaron. I need more time for the Real Housewives of Pick Your City. And so, but we started it and we enjoyed it. I always just say any project, let's do it until it stops being fun,
Right.
Yeah, any project, meaning that's my dating life too. Anyway, let's just see what happens until, this stopped being fun, bye. So he had originally started something with another friend and it just didn't go anywhere, so I bought the equipment off that friend for half. So I have hand-me-down podcasting equipment, so I think I paid all told maybe 500 or so.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so just so I also answer the money question. Yeah. And then how do you prepare for a guest? What do you do? What's your process for that?
Yeah, so preparing for a guest, even before then, I was reaching out to guests. And then after a while, with the podcast got popular and people were reaching out to me.
Oh, of course.
Even some Instagram poets. I was like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that I was that popular. Yeah. Yeah, so really started with like, who do I want to interview? Like, what voices are important? And one thing I said, like, I want to interview like just anyone about poetry. It doesn't have to be someone who's a well-known poet, and it doesn't even have to be someone who's published. I want to, interview, if you're a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker, like I want to talk to you about poetry and, what it means to you. So I talked to a lot of people just in my community. I had a friend who was a baker, and I invited them on, and we talked about, their job and baking, and then we ended up talking about body neutrality. That was like one of the bigger themes of our conversation. And then I interviewed a former poet laureate of Portsmouth, and then also started interviewing more well-known poets too. Like one of my more recent episodes, I interviewed John Murillo, which was a fabulous conversation. I think probably one of my favorite conversations, just because the flow was so easy. And that was actually the first time we ever had a conversation at length, was when I interviewed him. Which was interesting, that a lot of my encounters with folks, sometimes that was my first conversation with them ever. And like, it just was lovely to be able to have that be the way I was meeting them. But basically it started with the research, who do I want on the podcast, and then reaching out to them. And then I did a lot of the kind of like the housekeeping things, in Google Docs, coming up with like templates of like, okay, what are these email templates like? This is all really boring, but also like really important, because you're going to be sending the same email out over and over and over again. So make a template. Same thing with like the interview script. Like, what's my opening? And then what's the flow of everything? And how do I inform my guest of that? So I had another Google Doc that I would send out to my guests, and it would have all of the sample interview questions. And then I would make every guest a Google Doc folder where they would then upload all of the material, which would include like their bio, their author photos, so I could use to make the social media content, and then the 2 poems that they wanted to discuss on the podcast. So there was a lot of stuff that would happen that no one ever really saw, other than me and my Google Docs. And I set that all up beforehand. We were talking earlier about astrological signs, and I'm sure everyone can guess I am a Virgo. That's why everything was so organized so well. And I really just like thought about every single thing, and I'm really glad that I did that at the beginning. But then part of the interview is that I bring the voice in of the poet whose poem we read that the guest did not write. So, for instance, John Murillo brought in a poem by Yusef Komunyakaa. So I looked up a Yusef Komunyakaa interview and made sure to bring in Yusef's voice into the conversation, as well as a way to have him represented, not just only in the poem, but also in something that he might have said that I felt like could correlate to the conversation. And I thought that was a really important part of the interview that then developed later, and I didn't realize how important that was to the conversation until I did it, like the first time. I was like, oh, I liked that, and then I continued to do that. But just a lot of stuff that happened in Google Docs before even ever talking to a guest. But once I would get in front of them, like that was where the real joy came in, and it was just wonderful to be able to hear stories about everyone's favorite type of bread, and yeah, that was always fun. And no one wanted to like repeat the type of bread if they had heard an episode. They're like, oh well, that person said sourdough, I can't say it again. I'm like, yes you can. Like, your favorite type of bread can also be sourdough if you want it to be. But yeah, I think that answers your question.
Yeah. I love that Nathan McLean said English muffin.
Yes.
Because I would never have thought of that, and then when he said it, we're all tasting the English muffin, right? We all have like that. It's so weird, right? That
The nooks and crannies.
Yeah, right? Exactly. The texture and like is it painful when it's like too toasted? And yeah, exactly. Um, I'm going to turn it over to folks in a little bit. We'll get questions from you all. But I wondered, what did doing the podcast teach you about your poetry, or how has your poetry influenced how you approach the podcast?
Yeah, I think, like, as I mentioned before, a lot of the writing prompts, I ended up, using them to write my own poems too. And I think that really helped me just constantly, to think about different ways to approach poems, and to kind of have that just as a reminder of like, oh, this is easy. Like I'm handing someone the tool. Like I can also use this tool. It's not necessarily a tool that I've used before, but like I'm showing people how to use it. I might as well try it myself. And I really, really found that to be helpful, especially when I didn't know what to write about. I could always go back to a writing prompt that we talked about on the podcast. And it was also really helpful when I would teach workshops. As poet laureate, I would host free workshops in the city, especially during National Poetry Month. And like more often than not, I would use the podcast poetry prompts, writing prompts for that as well. So I think really what the podcast taught me about poetry in general, not so much like my own work, but just the way that it could bring community together. And I think so often I thought of poetry as like this, solitary act. I'm in solitude and writing my little sad poems in my journal. And I need that, and it's great how healing it is for me and wonderful. But also there's something about poetry that is, a community act as well. It's not just about, our own poetry, but also about how poetry can bring people, together in the same room. And also how a poem is, in a way, not only you communing with, yourself, but also, when you're reading someone's work, you're communing with that poet who you're reading as well. So it's all about sharing and being in community with one another, and how that being so community-based, how that then can be a tool to enact social change, which was, part of my mission too as poet laureate, was to use poetry as a tool to, enact social reform. And I developed this one event series called Poetry and Conversation, Love and Resistance, Poetry and Conversation. And I partnered with this one organization called NH Panther, and their mission is to end racism and systemic biases in the New Hampshire area. And every event we would highlight different marginalized voices. We would read, for instance, we had an event actually around Day of the Dead last year, and we read all Latinx voices, and we were sponsored by a local Mexican restaurant, and they provided free food for everyone. And then we were talking about poems. We were talking about Ada Limon and how, her poem was being sent to Jupiter's moon, and, it was just a really great way to bring everyone together. Yeah.
That's one of my favorite episodes of the podcast, by the way. I think someone reads a Judith Ortiz Cofer poem, too. Yes. Yeah, it rocks. That's a really cool, because it's like a live, like a recording of a live event. Yes. Yeah, on a podcast. A little bit meta. All right, well, I want to let other folks ask questions if you have them. Does anyone have a question? Oh, yeah, back here. Leo? I'm going to repeat your question, so go ahead and ask it, and then I'll repeat it, and then give the microphone to Gina.
All right. So you've mentioned making your poetry accessible, like through the podcast. And I'm wondering, have you ever found yourself in your own writing trying to balance the accessibility of the poem with your own voice?
So how do we balance the accessibility of the poem with our own voice?
I think I'm gonna try my best to answer that, at least in the way that I'm processing it. I think like one thing about my poetry is that the language itself is accessible. I don't use big words. That's not my strong suit. I think I was talking about it earlier with some folks. My vocabulary is very limited, probably because I spend most of my time watching Twilight. But you watch The Real Housewives? I'm watching Twilight. So anything that you hear in Twilight, it's in my poems. But I think that's one thing that makes my poetry accessible is the language that I choose to use, my diction. But however, that doesn't mean that the poems lack complexity or depth. It's just I don't, use the diction that I use doesn't have to be the way in which I achieve that complexity or that depth. It can come from the images that I'm, presenting, and also the way that I'm layering the information. I write a lot of collage poems, and one thing about collage that's so phenomenal is the way that you layer and order things, and that can change the way in which you process the information and changes the image, and changes how you relate, those sentences relate to one another. And that's something that I really, really enjoy is how am I layering this language rather to create that complexity as opposed to, using big words. I'm more interested in that. And quite honestly, it's a lot more fun to play with language in that way as material, as opposed to feeling like I need to, get this language from the sky. It's already there. It's just up to me to organize it in such a way that feels like something strange and sad that I would say. Yeah.
You talked earlier about just like when you met poetry, you fell in love with her.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think you also talk about demystifying poetry. And I think sometimes the idea of poetry is like big P poetry, poetry. And so how did you, this is maybe a question we would ask tomorrow night after your reading, but how did you say, I'm using my own voice, here's my voice? Because those are, your poems will go everywhere. They'll say anything. They'll use the world and the ways that people talk about the world or the body. Anyway, so how did you strike that balance?
I think one thing about poetry and about just the way that I kind of look at the world is that I'm so in love with the mundane of the world. I think it's just so wonderful. That's the stuff of life. It's not these wild things, or it's oh no, here I am walking by this piece of trash once again. What does that say about life? Must write poem now. That's what I love about poetry, is that you can write it about literally anything. And that just so happens to be one of the things that excites me is trash. So there's a lot of trash and fast food in my poems. My poems go anywhere. They'll be in a church. They'll be, at a trying to think of that fast food. At Popeyes. Yeah, Popeyes shows up in there too. Because that's the stuff of my life, and I find that to be so beautiful. And as someone who has experienced a lot of trauma in my past, that's also how I relate to the world. How, something that I see or witness could trigger, a memory or about a trauma. But also something that I see could also, trigger a poem. But my mind just constantly is working in that way. Even if I didn't choose for it to work that way. It just so happened that it does already, and then now I use it as a tool for poetry. It can feel quite damaging to have to carry that around all the time, being triggered by the world. But how can I change that? into a tool, for beauty, for art. And that's how I choose to do it, is to just use the mundane as a way to spark poetry.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And what else would we like to know?
You can ask me anything.
Yeah, it doesn't. You don't have to ask a podcast or. I'd like it to be kind of poetry related. I mean, I want to know like where. Yeah, I want to know like the color of your nail polish and where you get your clothes. But I can ask you maybe a little bit later than that. Anyone else want to ask a question? That's a good question about like how you trust the voice you hear in your head, and how can that still be poetry? It is. Yeah. Dr. Charles?
So I have a question that's angled a little bit for our students.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're consuming, both by choice and sort of coercion right now, so many literary texts, and frequent complaint is sort of information overload, which I think is something all of us can identify with in different sorts of ways. And in addition to watching Twilight, I'm wondering how you, if you have a practice for a commonplace book, or what you're doing with the poetry you read to make time for it still, but then also to keep it in some kind of way. Maybe it's just your brain, in which case I salute you, but do you have a way of organizing that that might be useful for some of our students who are reading a lot?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to repeat that question, Dr. Charles, and you're gonna have to remind me and tell me when I'm wrong. But what I'm hearing is like in an age of information overload, and especially with students who are hopefully reading actual books and electronic books too. But when you and then also like watching TV and listening to music and having like culture bear down on you in all of its like various ways. How do you make space for beauty? Is I think what I hear, and poetry.
And how do you organize?
And how do you organize? You see, I just skipped that part. I am not an organizer. Not a Virgo. Yep. Not at all. All right. So how do you organize?
Can I ask just clarification? How do I organize it, like in a tangible way? Could you?
So I guess I was thinking if you set aside time specifically for that kind of reading, but then also if you have a commonplace book, if you use Google Docs, if you use voice notes, or if you just underline and hope you find that page later, or
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. That definitely helps. Okay. So I think one way in which I continue to bring poetry into my life in a very intentional way is I'm also a teacher. I'm an educator. So what my students are consuming and reading, I'm also reading along with them. Even if I've read it, once before, I read it again. So I'm constantly like revisiting texts that I enjoy and that I love, and that I believe in too. That I feel like can teach them something important about poetry, or even just about themselves. So I'm constantly revisiting these texts in a way that feels very much like a ritual. So I come across like, oh yeah, I remember, I really liked that poem, and here it is, I underlined it, and I drew a little heart or an exclamation point. I'm constantly writing in all of the books that I own. I highly recommend writing in books. Do that. Even when I was in church, we were actually encouraged in church to write in our Bibles, which some people might consider that to be like blasphemy, but we were encouraged to write in our Bibles, that we were students of the Bible. So I just kind of carried that same practice into poetry. I was like, oh, I'm a student of poetry, well, I'm going to write in this book. It's not so precious. And this is coming from someone, too, whose mother was a librarian. And to write in a library book is like a no-no. But to write in your own books, it's like, yes, do that. And I love to borrow books from folks and see what they've underlined. Or even I like to lend my book to people, and I tell them, will you underline or like just mark it, please? Like I want your essence left here. And I just love to know how people think and what they, gravitate towards. But a lot of it's just organized right in the text. But I am a fan of using, my notes app, and if something really strikes me that I want to revisit later, I might write it down there, or I might write it down in my notebook that I keep relatively handy if I'm, let's say, like writing notes for class. Again, like whether I was an educator or when I was, a student as well, like I always kept a notebook handy when I was reading. And one thing that I make my students do is for every poetry collection that they read, they also have to hand in a page of notes. And these are MFA students, so I'm making MFA students do this type of work. And it's not so much busy work, but it's, again, a way in which to organize thoughts, and there are no rules about what this page of notes needs to look like. I tell them, you can draw on it if you want. Like, you can do whatever. You want to highlight it, you want to color, cool. I want you to organize it in a way that is how your mind works. If it's like bullet notes or if it's a paragraph, that's fine too. But it's just a way for them to just think on the page about the text that they were reading. What themes were prevalent in the book, what images continue to repeat themselves, things like that. I'm trying to think, did I miss part of the question, or is that it, or is that?
I think we did terrific.
Yeah.
Do that, students. Just do what.
Yeah. But then ways in which you can incorporate poetry into your daily life that doesn't feel so high stakes is subscribing to Poem a Day or Poem of the Day, which they'll just send a poem to your inbox, and it's only one poem. That's it. And it's okay, then you've consumed your poetry multivitamin that day. Is that one poem? You don't have to read an entire book. And the nice thing too is a lot of the times they have accompanying audio, so you can even just listen to it. You don't even have to look at the poem if you don't want to, or you can listen to it and look at the poem if you like me. I need to take things in with lots of different senses in order for it to stick. But I highly, highly recommend you subscribing to either one of those. One of them is run by poets.org and the other one by the Poetry Foundation. You can subscribe right on the website, or you can do the same thing with their podcasts as well. And it's just, you'll get to listen to a poem every day. I do that while I do my makeup or I fluff my afro. I'm listening to poetry then, and it's just a part of my daily life. And again, in the very mundane ways. That we get ready in the morning. Poetry is also there with me too. So I highly, highly recommend letting poetry just seep into every aspect of your life.
I also start my day with Poem a Day. How many of the poets in here do that? Yeah, there's a few of us who do that. Generally reading the poem as the coffee is brewing, and then I'm texting a friend how much I dislike the poem or something. I'm complaining about the poem, but that feels, and they're complaining, or they're no, it's actually really great, well, whatever. But that 15-minute text conversation that the poem starts, who cares if it's a good poem or not, right? The conversation that you get to have with somebody else, it has sparked that, and that's cool, whether or not the poem is for me. And I don't get to decide, by the way, all the good poems. There are poems that are very good, it's just not for me, that's fine too. And there's so many different poetries too, I wanted to say, right, yeah. So if you like music, when people say I don't like poetry, I'm that can't be true. You like music, right? There's so many different musics. It's saying you don't like any music at all. And I've never met that Scrooge. Any last question for? I have one last one too, but I'm happy to, if anyone else wants to ask something.
I have a very quick one.
Oh, good. Linda has a question.
What are you reading right now, and are you inspired by it?
What are you reading right now, and are you inspired by it?
Yeah. So last week I had my students read Hala Alian's new book, The Moon That Turns You Back. Beautiful, beautiful book. And I was definitely really inspired by the differing forms that are in this book. She has these interactive fiction poems, and it was like choose your own adventure, and you can read the same poem in like a variety of different ways, which I just thought was so exciting. And it's not something that I've ever tried before. So it was just something that I felt excited by, which I think is what you want in reading a poetry collection. And also before you start thinking about potentially writing something like that for yourself. Like if I'm excited by a form, the likelihood of me trying it for myself is very high. I don't think that I'll ever be able to write, a poem like Hala Alian's, interactive fiction poems, but like I'm so inspired by it that I'm willing to give it a shot. But yeah, that was one of the books that my students have read this semester, and they loved it, absolutely loved it.
That's cool. All right, so my last question is, could you give us a gluten-free segment right now? Or just like one of the prompts that from one of the gluten-free segments that you found productive or interesting or has worked?
I think I'll go back to the interview that I did with Matt Miller, who I talked about earlier. One of the breads that he talked about was pita bread. And the poem that he brought in, that he wrote, was titled The Next Time Through. And he was talking about, the next time through, he's going to be a better father. He's going to, build sandcastles with his children and this and so on. He just kind of continues to list over and over different things that he's going to do the next time through. And that was basically the prompt, was like, what are you going to do the next time through? And start the poem that way. The next time through, I'm going to ride my bike and just keep going. Or we also talked about writing a poem similarly in that same kind of vein of like speculating, is the blank that I was supposed to be. I think, because Matt is also an educator, I think he said he had one of the students write a poem like the cat I was supposed to be, or something like that, but it could be anything, just really letting yourself have fun with the poem and going places that you haven't been before. Because I think that's one of the ways in which poetry can, like our own poetry practice can become pretty stale, is if we're writing the same thing over and over again in the exact same way. Like I obviously write about the same thing all the time, but I want to be able to package it differently. Like I have my obsessions, absolutely, and they're not going to change, but how I present it to my reader, like that's where the fun lies. Like, okay, like now this is going to be a sonnet. No, this is going to be a sestina. Like it can be a sad sestina. It can be, a sad girl sonnet. It can be, anything you want. Just, giving yourself more tools in which to present your obsessions is something that I really enjoy and always have fun with. So.
Well, the next time through will be tomorrow.
Yes.
We'll get to hear you read from your poems. That's 6 p.m. here at the Lit House. Thank you so much for giving of yourself and talking about podcasts and poetry and power and community and just being a wonderful human being. So, and thank you all for coming out too. Can we thank our guests? That was all? Okay. I'm just kidding. That applause went on for a little bit. It was great. I loved it. And tomorrow night we will also have, I don't know that we have bread. We may have crackers, but we'll have some food and drink for you.
That's unleavened bread.
Yes, indeed. So anyway, come back tomorrow night. See you then. Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you.